All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with David Patte, Sunbreak Wine and Cider. We're here at Nicholson Library on the Linfield University campus, August 25th, 2020. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my honor. Thank you.
First question for you, as you probably know, is why wine?
Why wine? Well, I grew up in a French family. I was actually born in France, and you know, wine was always there for special occasions, especially for family reunions. And so just growing up in that culture, you know, it was always something I gravitated towards as I became a young adult and more aware. And I've had a lot of influences in my life that just kind of, you know, would come in periodically just to reinforce the value of great wine with great food. So certainly, you know, it was always associated for me with family and friends and get-togethers, but always around food as well. And as my wife and I got more interested in culinary arts and great food, we got more and more interested in great wine as well. I had an uncle who was a collector. So my French family is from the Rhone Valley and from the Riviera. When we immigrated to the United States, I was 4 years old. My dad was in graduate school, and we ended up staying and getting a permanent residency, and I became a citizen later on in graduate school. But my dad was a professor at university, and every summer we would go back and spend the summer on the family farm in the Rhone Valley. And there's a little bit of a history of winemaking in my family. We have my great uncle still lives on my great grandfather's property, which was a winery for the local chateau in the Ardèche. And so it was always there as a, you know, just kind of a touchstone. And I had an uncle who was a big collector, and his wife, Marie-Paul, is on one of my wine labels. And so Pinot Noir was his favorite to collect. And so right when Elizabeth and I started to appreciate wine, we were introduced to just amazing Pinot Noirs from Burgundy. And they also like to collect champagne, and so sparkling and champagne and very old vintages and amazing bottles that would come out with no labels and such. And so, you know, right from an early age, we really got into that. So I also make heritage cider, and the heritage cider is a more recent story. It really relates to the fact that when we moved from Portland about 5 years ago, we bought some property north of Corvallis, a beautiful rural property, which we called Sunbreak Gardens, and kind of got our wine name from that. And we had some huge apple trees, and our neighbors had huge apple trees. And I was interested in sparkling. I was studying winemaking, and so we started to play around with making cider, and then really started to explore what cider is, and cider is a form of winemaking, really. There's a hashtag out there, cider is wine. So, but heritage ciders, you know, these are traditional ciders like you would see in Normandy and in the United Kingdom and the Basque Country and Spain and all around Europe. And you know, these are dry ciders without any adjuncts and other fruit flavors added. So we're really trying to make a very wine-like cider that can be aged, is even better with age. So the heritage cider story came on later in my life. I really had not grown up drinking cider before we started making it. So it's been more of a recent journey on the cider side, but fun.
So as you kind of are developing this taste for wine, this interest in wine, tell me about at what point getting into it as a career becomes something you start thinking about, and when that does, what is your first step?
Yeah, so I had a 25-year career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I was really passionate, still am, very passionate about conservation, fish and wildlife conservation in particular. And just throughout those years, as my wife and I, you know, kind of transitioned into early career and having a little bit more, you know, available income, exploring wine. When we would go back to France to visit family, it was very convenient for us to fly into Paris and stop in Burgundy and have a couple days on our own, and then drive down and then do all the family visit. It was just a nice little entry point for my wife to get her language skills back up her ear. And then it became kind of a tradition for us on the way out too, after family visits, on the way back to Paris, we would stop there. And we got to, in our, I'd say like our third visit, we found a winery, a domaine, in the Haute Côte de Nuit that had bed and breakfast on the farm, you know, at the vineyard, at the winery. So the kids ran the B&B hospitality. The dad was the vigneron, you know, the winemaker and the vineyard manager. And the granddad had been same, and he was still around. So we got to know them very well and just visited them, you know, 4 or 5 times. And I think that planted a, you know, a little bit of a seed, definitely a very strong interest in not just appreciating great wine, but also how it's made and the vineyard side. And we'd have great wine tastings at their domaine, and he was quite funny and just loved to talk. But one of the key things I remember is his pride in not needing a lot of enology, lab work, and just being in touch with his wines, you know, visually and through sound, in terms of where they were and how safe they were. And another thing that struck me too was he didn't have an underground cellar, and we would visit in the summer, and he always regretted that he didn't have a cool cellar. And that he perhaps needed to sulfite his wines pretty heavily. And so that kind of stuck with me over the years and has informed my philosophy. But later on, we were living in Portland. We moved to Portland in 1995, and when we worked in and lived in Washington, D.C., Calvert Woodley was a great wine shop, and Burgundy, you know, wines were featured, and we really got to explore Burgundy. But when we came out to Oregon, you know, I just didn't have a great appreciation in the early 90s for Oregon wines, and we moved out here and we found out that this is the land of Pinot and Chardonnay. We were just in heaven. And the climate is very similar to what I remembered my summers in the Rhone Valley, very Mediterranean climate. And so we just fell in love and just started exploring all the wineries out in Oregon. What really started to pique my interest in the wine and vineyard side, we decided to, with some friends, buy a country property in the Columbia Gorge, just east of Mount Adams. And through friends, we met some dear friends of ours who we've been in touch now for more than 20 years. Thomas and Marlene Woodward have a beautiful vineyard called Oak Ridge, high elevation above White Salmon and Hewson. And you know, so we got to know the whole vineyard side and the cycle, and helping them out occasionally and house sitting for them and reading all of their books and their periodicals on viticulture. So then that really did get me thinking about if I ever were to be able to retire early or a second career as a winemaker and vineyard owner. And kind of fast forward, you know, in the Fish and Wildlife Service, there were some budget issues in the second Obama administration cycle with Congress and budget cutbacks, and at the agency they were offering early retirements for anyone over 50. So at 52 I had the opportunity to retire early with a little bit of a pension and health care and all these things, and So we started looking for vineyard properties in the gorge. We actually made a couple of offers on vineyard property, and so my mindset was really strongly rooted in managing a vineyard and making wines. But as we started to explore the financial aspects of that, it kind of became clear to me that I would either do one or the other. It would be hard to do both, given our finances and not wanting to take out huge loans or get investors. So at the same time, I had volunteered and started exploring all the urban wineries in Portland while we lived there. And I volunteered with a small winery called Clay Pigeon. And Michael Claypool, we would frequent the restaurant with Sasha and Michael and got to know them very well. And we happened to have a government shutdown, I think it was in 2013, and it was right during harvest. It was like 3 weeks off right during harvest. And so I volunteered and I helped them out a little bit, a lot, I don't know, it's hard to remember, but it certainly made a big impact on me that this seemed a lot even more fun and more rewarding than maybe on the vineyard side. And it could be done at a small scale too. That kind of opened my eyes too, that you didn't have to start or even have a super large winery to be making very high-end quality wines. And Michael was just so gracious and put up with all my little questions. And you start at the bottom. If you don't enjoy cleaning tanks, that's how you start. But just going through all those process, just learning how to use the equipment and helping with harvest, that really got me going then. And when we did have that ability to transition into a second career, then my mind was pretty well set, and we started to look more broadly for properties because we weren't at that point tied into finding a vineyard property. We could find any property and then learn winemaking and work in the winemaking side of it and become a winemaker. So it's kind of a long series of evolution of influences that influenced me. One little step at a time. And then, there's so many others as I then took the plunge. So many great mentors, and talk about those a little bit too. The last 5 years, last 5 vintages that I've been able to participate in. So
I know before you started your brand, you mentioned Michael Claypool, obviously, but other people you worked with as well. Tell me about kind of the experience of kind of seeing different operations and different ways to do what you wanted to do.
Well, we loved Brooks. We were members at Brooks. We loved Christum. We obviously had visited Burgundy many times. And in that process, too, my nephew was interested. He was in wine sales in Atlanta, and he was interested in coming out and potentially working in the wine industry here in Oregon. So he came out for a visit, and through Thomas and Marlene, Oak Ridge Vineyard, we went around and met all the winemakers of the Columbia Gorge and really got to know several of them. And Ben ended up moving out here and working for a couple of different wineries in the Columbia Gorge and then starting his own label. So that was a nice transition. So right when I was getting started in winemaking, and taking classes at Chemeketa, doing harvest internships. Then Ben started Milan Wines, and I got to work with him, which was a great joy, and learn what he had learned from Nate at High-U Vineyard, and others that he had worked with in more of a natural winemaking style. And so that was a big influence on me after doing I did harvest internships with Anderson family wines, and that was both in the vineyard and in the cellar, which was really nice to see both sides of that. And then I started working in the tasting room at Lumos, which I really recommend for anyone starting in the winemaking business. to see the client side and have that client interaction. And to work in a tasting room for 4 years with Lumos Wines, just great Pinot Noirs, but we were able to serve 6 different Pinot Noirs from Temperance Hill and 5 different white wines. And so you get to see a great number of styles and how people respond to the different styles of Pinot Noir that we were serving, the different types of white wines. And also sticking with it for 4 years and seeing how those wines evolve, especially the red wines. You know, when you serve them for the club release and then serve them in the tasting room the next year, and then follow-up events the following year, and really seeing the evolution and how things change, especially in those first 3 years, is really valuable as someone who's learning along the way. And so I signed up to do an internship with Lumos, and small winery, and so I was expecting something small, just like Anderson family, a couple weeks of really intense work. And I showed up at the winery and looked around and just saw this huge facility. And then I was told that it was really a combined staff of like 3 full-time cellar hands, and we were going to process wine for Dominio 4, Native Flora, Lumos, and 3 other wineries. And so I hadn't quite realized I'd signed up for 12-hour days for nonstop for 4 weeks, and then we got a day off for the following 3 weeks, and then we had weekends off after that, and then it was one of those really intense, but it was really great because what an experience to have a cellar internship and work with 5 different winemakers and seeing how they handle winemaking differently, and all the fermentations going on, and some do it a little bit differently, and all the different choices. And then, so you're studying in class at the same time, and then you're seeing all these winemakers that have taken all these different paths and different choices. And then I work with my nephew, and he's like 100% natural winemaking, and no machinery if possible, so no destemming, and seeing how those wines turn out. So that's a really fascinating part, I think, about being a winemaker. Is I really like working with a single vineyard as much as I can, so I can really work hard at expressing the terroir or the site as best I can through the Pinot Noir. But then you start to think about the many decisions as a winemaker you have in influencing the style of that wine that comes from that winery, and which style best represents that vineyard. Or do you like different styles from that same vineyard? And so that really fueled my curiosity and my passion even further to really find one vineyard and kind of stick with it. As Providence would have it, you just have these little forks in the road that come up. A friend of a friend had a vineyard right next to Brooks, and we had been going up to Brooks as club members forever, my wife and I. And right across the street from the Brooks estate, a fellow by the name of Mark Rose had started a vineyard there. And he was a friend of a friend, and his vineyard was just kind of, was young and growing. He hadn't sold all his grapes in 2017, and he had a lot of grapes left over. And so our friends, Bart and Dale, introduced us to Mark, and we all went, Mark and I went out and picked from the vineyard and did some home wines in his garage, and had enough to do 3 barrels, so it was a serious enough attempt. And we did a little bit of both. We did some whole cluster and destemming, and free run versus barrel versus press, and how we liked, and all of those little things. And then the following year, Jessica Cortel became a co-owner of that vineyard. So it's called Cortel Rose. And she's just a fabulous vineyard manager. She manages organically. She has another vineyard that she owns, Carlisle, and she manages some of the top-end vineyards in the valley, Seven Springs, Antica Terra, Medici, just a whole bunch of others. So once she came on board, the light bulb came on for me. It was like, you know, there are grapes available at this vineyard, and it's probably not going to last too long. And if I don't jump in right now, you know, I have the potential of a pretty strong allocation from this vineyard because I know one of the owners. And so I did. In 2018, I just kind of jumped in. And as luck would have it, Ben was looking for winery space and was having trouble finding something in the Columbia Gorge. And we ended up finding for him a custom crush facility, which really allows the winemakers to be involved as well, which is really kind of what we were looking for. And it happened to be the old Brooks Winery where I used to go, you know, pick up my wine and talk to the winemakers and get the tours. And so I'm just kind of pinching myself, like just seems surreal. I'm just doing this full circle of, you know, 20 years ago I used to be a club member, and now I'll be making wine in this facility. And John Grishow had managed it, and he was moving to a larger facility, and Vincent Fricci, Vincent Wine Company, is now the manager of that facility. And he's just a great guy and a great mentor, and he's really given me the confidence to really get started and to expand a little bit, and just a great, you know, welcoming kind of cooperative spirit at that winery, and there are several others, Championship Bottle, and now Libertine. Alex with Libertine is coming on board. So it's just going to be a great team. And so it's a fun place to be. You're not in an urban winery setting. You're up there with the vineyards. It's very inspiring, and the view of the Cascades. So it's fun, and for me, you know, it's just so nice because every time I go to the winery, you know, every couple of weeks at Top Barrels or for whatever reason, I drive right by the vineyard, and I get to stop and visit the vineyard and really feel a little bit more connected to the vineyard work, and talking with Jessica about what's going on and what some of the challenges are that particular year, and how the vintage is coming along. So everything just kind of fell into place, and it just felt like it was meant to be. So then, you know, the question was, you know, can I make some really good wine? So, so that's the trick, you know. So. And my first vintage is out, and so far people love it, so that's good. So
excellent. Come back to that in just a second. I'm curious about something else. You mentioned you're kind of doing you go to school, you're doing internships around, you're kind of finding things to do. Usually a young person's game. I'm kind of curious about doing that as a second career and trying to keep up with the people who are usually doing that exact same thing, yet maybe a little bit younger than you.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and the camaraderie, and everyone was super welcoming. And I could tell when I first showed up for that first Harvard, my first internship interview. I remember Cliff Anderson, really looking at me and say, "Okay, you're kind of a former executive desk job guy. Are you really going to be up to the physical labor?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course. I'm fit. I bike to work every day. I grew up on a farm, and I grew up picking peaches all summer long and moving irrigation ditches." And then he said, "Oh, you grew up on a farm. You're hired. You know exactly what this is about." So the being on the family farm, it is true. It's interesting. I did want that kind of career executive job and role in life for quite a while, but after sitting at a desk for a while, that kind of starts to lose its appeal, and you're ready to do something more physical. And then just the intellectual stimulus of learning a new craft and the whole winemaking side and everything that goes into it. And it was the same thing at Lumos. You know, all the young guys, they were like, "Oh, this guy, he's." Well, my benefit there was that. See, the younger guys, after a 12-hour day, they would go socialize at the bars and maybe not sleep as much as me. And so, not to name names, but I would show up the next day to work and be all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and able to put in another 12 hours of hard labor. But I think also they had a little pity on me, so I got to be the forklift operator, which was very fun. You know, it's like bumper cars. You know, it goes back to your childhood. You know, this is so much fun. So that was a really nice skill to pick up too, is to, you know, have a couple of years of a lot of forklift work, many hours of forklifts. I feel very comfortable with that kind of equipment. So that's a great benefit to have that. But you know, overall, everyone was super. It's just true everywhere you know, most people you meet in the Oregon wine industry are just very open, very willing to share their knowledge and their expertise, and open to others entering the field. And I certainly found that to be the case. You know, I ask a lot of questions whenever I'm in a cellar, and everyone was just super helpful all along the way.
So you had kind of a simultaneous book learning, on-the-job learning, kind of going at the same time. I'm curious about, along the way, sort of as you're thinking about, when I do this on my own, this is what I want to do. Tell me about kind of developing your philosophy, developing the style you want to use, or the wine you want to produce, and kind of how you went about creating that philosophy from all the disparate parts.
Yeah, you know, I initially was really more of a fan of destemmed Pinot Noir and a little bit lighter style. But as I worked in the tasting room and worked with my nephew with whole cluster, I became more and more intrigued with, you know, just the added complexity that you get with that, and a little bit lighter fruitiness. There's a little bit of carbonic maceration that occurs. It can be tricky. So there's some challenges with 100% whole cluster. And then at IPNC, I volunteered at IPNC for 3 years and got to really spend a little bit of time talking to some of the vignerons from France about their use of whole cluster, and then Christum here, and Goodfellow, and White Rose, and some of the great Oregon wineries that really focus on whole cluster. And again, my nephew at Lumos Wines, and I think certainly he learned that from Hayu in Columbia Gorge. And so I became more and more fascinated by it. And then, you know, the kind of the fabled wines from Burgundy, from Romanée-Conti and Dujac, almost exclusively whole cluster, you know, through their history. And really, if you think about whole cluster Pinot Noir, that was the traditional way, you know, foot tread. No, you know, there weren't machines, there were no destemmers before 1960s maybe, and in the 60s and the 70s, the destemmers were very crude and very harsh. And so, you know, destemming is actually a very recent trend in Pinot Noir winemaking. So that's been a big part of what I do. I now do half destemmed, and half of the fermentations are 100% destemmed, half are 100% whole cluster. And I make 3 different styles of Pinot. So the Colette will be 100% destemmed Pinot. The Marie Paul will have 50-50, so it'll be a blend of the barrels from each of those fermentation types. And then the Ariane Pinot Noir is going to be 100% whole cluster. And what I do is I invite my clients to really explore all 3 as an expression of that vineyard, and 3 different styles from one vineyard. And which do you prefer? And they're all very different from each other. But everyone has their fans. I certainly like all 3 for what they bring. And so I really thought initially I would do all three styles and eventually pick a favorite. But based on the feedback and based on my kind of like now 2 or 3 years of exploring this, I really enjoy having the diversity of all three styles. So a little bit lighter, more fruit forward, to the more more tannin. It'd be more of a vin de garde, so more of a wine that's going to maybe age a little bit more, a little bit more structure, and then the one that's a blend of the two, and exploring all three of those styles. The second other big winemaking decision for me, when I was making a lot of wines at home, we didn't find the need to use sulfites, added sulfites, because we weren't in a winery setting, so everything was pretty clean. No spoilage organisms or yeast and bacteria that can kind of go out of control and cause either very acidic wines or maybe some off-putting odors with Brett and a lot of other associated organisms. And as I started to really enjoy those with some of our friends, and they really commented on the lack of sulfites in the red wine, for them being more enjoyable and having not really an allergic reaction to sulfites, but maybe feeling better the next morning with wines without sulfites. And so there's a little bit of a health or perceived health aspect, but certainly it seemed to me that the wines would always present much more fruitiness right off the bat, especially right after bottling. We don't sulfite at bottling, and so there's no real bottle shock that occurs, and you can start enjoying these wines, and they just open up and are really alive and really open up nicely right at an early age. So a lot of tastings I've done in Burgundy, a lot of sulfur, a lot of tannins, and you do the tasting at the wineries and they'll tell you right off the bat, set this aside for 2 or 3 years. It's not very drinkable right now. It's a little harsh, and and just working in a tasting room and talking with clients, no one can cellar wines very well. Not very many people have a cellar and have the ability to keep wines for 2 or 3 years. So I think the reality too is that as you present wine to people in today's world, it really needs to be drinkable. I think right off the bat, and it needs to present nicely. Certainly in a restaurant environment, if you think about the maître d' or your waiter or sommelier opens a bottle and presents the wine to you right away without decanting, without aeration, to maybe reduce the sulfites or other things that might be going on. So I certainly think it's an advantage that way to be able to make a wine that is a little more lively and fresh, and shows great fruit and complexity without the sulfites. So that's been a tremendous challenge, to solve those issues of winemaking without sulfites along the way. And there's some trade-offs for all the different decisions we make in the winery. But I feel like the no sulfites is a worthy trade-off, and I take several steps to make sure the wines are clean, present really nicely, don't suffer from oxidation, so the sulfites do two things. They help prevent premature oxidation, as well as what we call spoilage organisms, or organisms that can cause some issues with your wine. So learning how to really handle, make sure we don't have premature oxidation and the wines are clean as well. So there's several steps we take along the way to ensure that happens. So we get a really, beautiful wine with great complexity and length. and clean, but natural in a sense of not having sulfites. And for me, the two most important parts of being a natural wine are how the grapes are grown, so organic practices, so you get some diversity of yeast and cultures, that might occur in the vineyard that you can bring into the winery. And then no sulfites added at the winery. But I do take some other steps that would take me out of the natural winemaking category to make my wines what they are. So we have a little bit of a foot in both worlds there. So.
You talked about presenting your wines. I'm curious about after a lot of build-up, when you actually do go to present something to a customer, to a som, to a restaurant. Tell me about that, kind of the process of that, and the feeling of presenting a wine that you've made to someone in that way.
Yeah, it's a great feeling to be selling your own wines and talking about your own wines after years of helping others sell their wines, which I loved doing. Because you can really tell the full story and really answer all the questions along the way and talk about your philosophy and tell the whole story. But on the downside, you're also very aware of any shortcomings that you might have perceived. And so you have to play this fine line, because I feel like I know my wines so well and my ciders so well that I feel like, okay, next year I can do a little bit better by doing this. And so, because you're always trying to improve, and you always want you always have this idea that your next vintage is going to be your best vintage, and there's always something you can improve upon. So you do have to kind of relax a little bit and let the wines present themselves and have that natural conversation with either a client or a wine buyer at the retail, and let them come to a little bit of their own conclusions and help guide that discussion. Mm-hmm. And there are three types of folks out there who are wine enthusiasts, and actually most winemakers will be shocked to know that maybe 20% are interested in winemaking techniques. Most are interested in understanding and enjoying the wine and the flavors and the pairings with food and the social aspects of a wine that can be enjoyed by, buying and enjoying a wine that others are going to enjoy, because there are a whole group of folks that the social aspect of wine drinking is the most important for them. And they certainly want to bring home wines that at the family table everyone's going to enjoy. So maybe they're not as interested in, shall we say, like difficult wines or esoteric wines, mm-hmm. as much as some other connoisseurs, which are more interested in food pairings, and they want a real diversity in palate, and they are interested in a full panoply of different styles of wine, because they understand how those nuances can really help flavors, with different foods. And then connoisseurs, collectors, they and wine scores in general, from wine writers, part of the score, a big chunk of the score, is the ageability of the wine. Mm-hmm. And they're very interested in the ageability of the wine. So you have three very different audiences, and so I also thought that making three different styles of Pinot and three different styles of heritage cider would appeal. They're really kind of designed in a way by accident, but it nicely fits into this narrative of there are different types of wine enthusiasts, mm-hmm. for different reasons. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I was really pleased to see the reception of my 2018 release, which was released just right during the pandemic, but people really enthusiastic for one or the other Pinot Noir, and selling out of the D-stem, the Colette, very quickly. And if you think about it, that's the D stem, that's the one that's more approachable in its youth. And sure enough, you know, people, they would buy a couple bottles and then they would come back for 4 cases. I was just shocked, you know, pleasingly shocked, which was great. So it sold out very, very quickly, which was really nice, because we produced 300 cases in the 2018 vintage. And I had you know, when we were barrel tasting, I was getting really good feedback from winemakers and connoisseurs and enthusiasts. And so I just took the plunge and decided to double production in 2019, all pre-pandemic. And so, you know, when the pandemic hits, I'm just a little concerned about, oh my gosh, I've got 300 cases of 18 and then 600 cases of 2019 in the winery, and how's this all going to work out? So luckily it's worked out really well. So
I'm going to come back to that because I'm curious about that. Obviously, dropping your first wine during a pandemic is probably not ideal, but we'll come back to that in a second.
Yeah, boy, that was a strange few weeks there initially.
I'm curious about the cider aspect as well. You talked about 3 different kinds of Pinots, 3 different kinds of ciders.
Yeah.
Tell me about the cider making, if it's how it's similar and different to the winemaking, and talk about like the audience for it. I'm curious about if you're finding people who like both, or if you're finding very specific audiences for either.
Yeah, for the most part, the audiences, there's been some overlap in clients that love both. But they do seem to be, you know, different, certainly different, very retail. The retail audience is very different on the retail side. But you know, I came to the cider making from a winemaker's perspective of sparkling wine. So really adopting all the methods that you would with a champagne method, and this méthode champagnoise, and just not doing the step with the disgorging. But we do the whole thing with the bottle carbonation, where you know, add yeast and sugar to your tank and then put that in bottle. The only step we don't take, just due to labor and affordability and the cider, you know, market the way it is, there's only so much you can charge per bottle. And that extra step of disgorging the yeast, you know, from the bottle would just be one step too much at the winery. But I've come up with a nice method that really leaves very little sediment and very little yeast. And cider is very lightly carbonated, so you don't have to, you know, have a lot of yeast in the bottle for the carbonation. But you know, it's really a style that some call like an orchard-based. So very similar to wine. Working with apples in my valley that friends have allowed me to pick. One friend in particular, Bruce Bartlett, has a former orchard that he used to manage commercially that is completely no spray and unmanaged, and I get to pick there, and those are my Liberty apples. The Gravensteins are from my property, so we do a Gravenstein Gold, Liberty Red. And as I was doing that, you know, in the home environment, I quickly found out that if I could add good quality heirloom heritage cider fruit to those more basic, if you will, dessert fruit, you would then get to a cider that really approached more of what you find in Normandy and Britain and Wales and the Basque Country. And so then I started exploring a little bit with Idle Acres Orchard, which is in Marion County, and then now there's a new orchard in the Corvallis area on Kyger Island. Two new orchards, Jolly Farms and Wombat Flats, and they do a lot of organic practices as well, not 100% organic, but super happy with their heritage fruit. And so now I'm using a lot more of this traditional heritage fruit, so you get a lot more tannin, you get more depth of flavor, more length, which is really difficult to do on a cider or a sparkling wine, is to get that length and that nice finish, and bright acidity and good sharpness. So And so the Gravenstein being much more like that green apple bright style, the Liberty Red, a little bit more full-bodied, more red apple. The Idle Acres Perfection is 100% heirloom fruit, so a lot more tannin, a lot more ageability in that wine, in that cider. And this year too, I'll be launching a fourth cider, which it's out on social media as a bit of a mystery, so I'm not going to tell exactly what it is, but it's going to be a single varietal traditional cider that I believe will be the first cider producer outside of England to make this single varietal. So
Very
that's
cool.
a little bit of a guess, but the first 6 people that guess correctly get some prizes. So, so I'm not going to reveal it right here.
Nice.
So that kind of exploring that a little bit. But I have a great distributor in Oregon right now, and the retail sales on that have really taken off. So, you know, I'm really not trying to fill the niche that so many great cider makers have already taken with adding other fruit flavors to ciders and so-called adjuncts. So this is all traditional heritage style, and just trying to develop that portion of the market. There are several cider makers that are in that camp and trying to expand that market, and I'm just more than happy to help expand, you know, that side of cider making. It's a little bit more serious cider that you would that pairs well with food, that really can stand up to food. Has more tannin, has more structure, has more brightness, natural acidity from some of the more tannic crab apples and other bitter sharps and sharp heirloom apples that we are able to use. So, and it's really more of a passion project because there's just no money in it, so the profits are just terrible. So, the heritage fruit is very expensive, and we can't, you know, it's cider, and you can only charge a certain, $8 or $9 per bottle for a 500 milliliter bottle, and you can't go too far above that. So,
in terms of for me specifically, and for I'm guessing many people who will watch this who are unfamiliar with cider making, how different is the process once the fruit's off the tree? Is it very similar to winemaking?
It's very similar to white winemaking and sparkling wine.
Okay.
Yeah. The only difference, going to press, obviously you can't use a whole apple going into the press. So you just go through a process of chopping that up through these, kind of like these grinders, and then that goes into a press, and you get the juice, and you ferment the juice. So it's very, at that point, you're very much into the white wine world, and you ferment that dry, and then you think about your carbonation just like you would in a traditional champagne method. And so there's a certain amount of aging you may or may not want to do, depending on how much tannin you have in your cider, and if you want the tannins to mellow out a little bit, you might want to age that cider a little bit longer. And then right before bottling, you're going to pitch yeast and sugar or apple concentrate or something to kind of reinitiate a secondary fermentation that you'll put into the bottle to create the carbonation in the bottle. So that's very similar to champagne. Obviously, champagne has a much longer process and with cuvées that are meant to age quite a long time before. For each step of the process, and thus expensive. Champagne, it can be, just like port, it can be a multi-year and generational project of continuing these large cuvées that are part of the program. So it'd be fun to have that in a cider, ideal cider world too. But our pHs, our natural acidity is not as low as in wine. So there's some limitations there. You have a higher pH, less acidity, and the trick there. And again, I use no sulfites, so keeping a no sulfite cider from spoiling, from turning to vinegar, it's you really have to be on your toes because. And also the pH is pretty high, so there are a lot of lactic acid bacteria that can start producing all these funky notes. which is okay and acceptable in the cider and beer world. Like a sour beer. So a little bit of it is okay, but not too much. So kind of that farmhouse style. So.
All right. So we talked earlier. On obviously releasing your first wine during a pandemic. Tell me about sort of the effects the pandemic has had on your wine life, your cider life, and how you sort of navigated the last few months and are looking ahead at navigating the next few months.
Yeah, I was really worried initially. I mean, my idea especially for the wine, I had already released cider, so the cider was out in the marketplace. But one thing, I had my distributor in Oregon was very restaurant based, and I hadn't really thought about even asking that question when I was selecting distributors and interviewing with distributors. And so they were immediately affected by the pandemic and the shutdowns. And so I had some new cider to come to market, and they couldn't purchase anything. And so that was an immediate concern. And then for the wine, I was really kind of waiting to release all three of my wines. The Colette, the destemmed, had been released in the fall, but I was waiting for the other two wines, the Ariane and Marie Paul, to be ready in the spring, and then bring all three of those wines to distributors. And my idea was to focus on a few out-of-state distributors, with the idea that, I go to Tennessee to visit my parents twice a year, so let's focus there. I have a dear sister-in-law in the Philly area, and so that would be a great place because I could stay with her, and I know those areas a little bit. And so things like that. I had 8 or 9 meetings with distributors in different states set up, and all that in the month of March. And a couple of wine club, kind of more digital, sales-oriented wine buyers, and all that fell through. And so suddenly, I had a friend who told us that, the thing to do is to start doing wine Zoom tastings, and I just laughed. I was like, that's never gonna happen. No one's gonna want to do that. But sure enough, you start to learn there were some worse places to be. I hadn't invested in on-premise. Cost of a tasting room or construction of a tasting room would be even worse. So I didn't have those investments in on-premise. And the second silver lining was I quickly found that all my former friends and colleagues from the Portland area were all working at home. So suddenly home deliveries became a reality. Very little traffic, and you could go to Portland and make 15 deliveries in one day, no problem. And then I was exploring digital sales and posted something on wineberserkers.com, which is this great wine internet blog that a lot of enthusiasts follow. And they had a kind of a pandemic quarantine sale for small wineries. So I posted something there, and it caught the attention of a wine writer with the Wall Street Journal, Letty Teague. She saw that, and I had kind of thrown it out there that, hey, this is kind of an awkward time to be launching a winery right during a pandemic, but here I am, so try my wines. And she saw that, and she was intrigued because she was doing a story on the effects of the pandemic on the wine industry. And I got an email from her just kind of out of the blue asking for an interview. And I kind of turned to my wife, Elizabeth. I said, Letty Teague just sent me an email and wants to do an interview. Do you know who that is? And she kind of jumped out of her chair and said, Letty Teague! She's really famous. So we used to get Food and Wine magazine, and she was the wine editor and wine writer for Food and Wine. And when we were younger, it was a big part of our one of the periodicals that we followed very closely. And so she had remembered the name, I had forgotten. And sure enough, that afternoon, I'm sitting at the parking lot at the UPS store doing some wine deliveries, and we do the interview in the car. And she put me in the story. It was a long story, and she hadn't reviewed my wines or anything, but I was kind of the lead in the first paragraph. And I just started getting inquiries and orders online from that, so it was really, really great. So for a young winery, I now have an email list of 400 folks, and I've had over 100 folks have ordered online through our store, online sales. So it's been great. And some of those folks, enthusiasts, they read that, and they were also Wine Berserker enthusiasts. And they were also ambassadors for my brand. They were used to hosting friends for wine tastings, and so I got several calls from people like that who, I didn't even have to organize it. They organized the Zoom tastings with all their friends, and those we would ship like 6 bottles and share that with 6 couples. And then they would all have it, and then they would all order after the Zoom tasting. So it just kind of had several people. I had 4 people like that who organized these. The largest one, I think we had 20 different couples, and each of those couples had ordered all three wines, and so we talked through all 3, and then the resulting sales from that, and just the networking. It was just amazing. So and then with the home deliveries. That really made up for my lack of distribution in the retail space. And now I'm really, back to focusing. I've got a new distributor for the cider and the wine. And we're now in the retail space in 4 or 5 different spots. But it's really hard in Oregon to get on a shelf. There's a lot of competition for Pinot Noir, and I certainly understand that. But it's been great. I've been selected as a partner winery with the Oregon Wine Lab in Eugene.
Oh, very cool.
And that's really, really nice. Mark, the host winery is called William Rose, and I've always really enjoyed their wines. And certainly in Corvallis, they're very easy to find William Rose wines. So I had known about them and was very interested in joining their cooperative. And so they invite 7 or 8 other wineries to be part of the lab. Stands for Local Artisan Brands. And so they have a really nice wine lounge in Eugene with a food truck outside and plenty of outdoor seating. And so they help sell my cider and my wine at the location, and then also through their wine club. So it's been great. They've put in very large orders, and so I can suddenly now have a really nice presence in the Eugene area, as well as the Mid-Valley, Corvallis, and Portland. That's been just really nice. And next steps are to find more distribution in other states, and keep growing that. And more, in terms of digital sales, I think as winemakers and winery owners, using this kind of pandemic, I think a lot of folks have really stepped up in terms of building better relationships with clients through Zoom or other communications. Offering your clients, more accessibility to just experiences with the winemakers, as well as discounting, and you're seeing more like free shipping. And I think that's making our wines, hopefully, premium wines more affordable, maybe without the additional shipping cost. And we just need to learn to absorb that, and you would absorb those costs anyway through distribution channels, the 3-tiered system, with the distributor getting 30% and the retail getting 30%. So you can just look at all those trade-offs, and why not build your email list and your direct sales to consumers as best you can, through this. And so I think it seems like the statistics are there. Direct-to-consumer sales are up, helping make up the loss for on-premise sales, which has been been great. So
The moral of the story is people are going to buy wine as long as they possibly can.
yeah.
Any way they possibly can.
And I have so many clients and friends who have told me that they have a little bit more money now to maybe get into that more premium category, since they're not eating out, they're not taking out of state vacations. Those who still have employment and aren't suffering, loss of income, they are willing to try and have a little bit of money to extra income to try, maybe a better brand and maybe see the difference between the value Pinot Noirs that are under 20 and made in a larger, they're just not going to have the kind of complexity that we as small producers can help provide, in a smaller setting and more care and management. Longer élevage or longer barrel aging of your wines, which really help concentrate the flavors. So the barrel is such an ideal vessel for winemaking because it's permeable, right? So there's an air exchange, and the longer you keep your red wine in barrel, the more water evaporation. So wine is mostly 80% water or more. And the less water you have, the more evaporation, the more concentrated the flavors and the profile of that wine becomes. And that's the real secret of aging. The other thing of aging your wines a little bit longer is if you do have a tannin profile that's maybe a little harsh, those tannins start to smooth out with that micro-oxygenation over time. And they tend to smooth out over time. So you get that double benefit of aging your wines in barrel. And so that, I think that's part of what distinguishes us as premium winemakers. The other big thing is just having smaller fermentation vessels. You get into a very large fermentation tank, and it's real easy for the temperatures of that fermentation tank to spike, almost out of control, but get up into the 90s pretty easily, and then you start to, a lot of the flavors and esters and a lot of the flavor compounds can volatilize, can basically evaporate from your wine and escape the wine. It definitely changes the character of the wine. We've seen a lot of wine trials that at Symposium, they have wine trials at the Oregon Symposium every year, and you can try. One year they did, I think it was Adelsheim or a different producer had tried different temperatures, and they only had like a 4-degree Fahrenheit temperature in their fermentations. The exact same grapes and same process, and they tasted differently, and so it's just a reminder of fermentation temperatures being pretty important. And then the other thing in large-scale winemaking, it's like you kind of scratch your head, well, how did you process 100 tons of fruit in 6 hours? Well, you just don't sort the fruit. It goes straight into the fermentation, or the destemmer, and into fermentation without sorting. So that's the other big quality aspect of a small producer. We take the time, all the small quality producers take the time to sort fruit, so you don't get any leaves that can cause some of that green kind of pyrazine flavors and vegetal, or any mildew or rot in the bunches, depending. And it can be especially important on difficult vintage years, such as 2019, where we did have a lot of rain and cold weather at the end there, so sorting fruit was really imperative.
So with that said, what do you see as you look ahead for your label? What do you see in terms of growth, in terms of expansion, in terms of variety? As you look ahead, what do you kind of hope to be 5-10 years down the road?
Well, just take it one year at a time, but I initially thought I would love to do the 3 styles from different vineyards, but now I'm more focused on trying to express the Cortel Rose Vineyard as fully as I can, and try to get all 6 clones represented as the vineyard owner had the vision of, and sort of like an estate vineyard. You know, if you plant 6 clones, it's because you really have this idea that using all 6 Pinot Noir clones or varietals, if you will, in your wine are going to make a greater wine, a more, you know, balanced wine, and certainly more complex wine. So I would love to be able to do all 3 styles with all 6 clones, and I'm still pretty far away from that in terms of volume. So I think I'll just keep plugging away at that for the short term. And in the long term, you know, would love to also incorporate some white wines and rosés. And so we do have plans for rosé and even a port, a Pinot Noir port this year, so to get that started. And for the cider, probably we'll try to keep that to just Oregon for now and keep it small and manageable because unless I find a partner who really wants to take on much larger volumes and multi-state branding, that's a whole different. It just seems like that's a whole different world, you know, once you get into those volumes. And so we'll keep that small for now, but so small for me, there's so many definitions of that, is about 600 cases in the wine world, and about same actually 600 or 700 or 800 cases for the cider, plus kegs, you know, all the kegs too. So yeah.
Do you see that number growing significantly as you go ahead, as you're kind of trying different styles?
Yeah, you know, maybe incrementally growing, but there's certainly no business plan right now that we're going to double every year, you know, that kind of thing. I have been doubling, you know, my first few years, so maybe that's not going to. Maybe I'll continue to do that, but it's. It takes a little financial fortitude coming into this business, especially the wine, where you buy your grapes, and then in year 3 you start selling your wine. So it takes a little bit of a little tolerance for risk and some financial resources that are certainly there. In cider, it's much more quick to market, so you do feel like there's a little bit less risk there, and you get maybe more direct feedback, you know, from the marketplace, and ability to grow and meet that demand, you know. So it's much more acceptable in the cider and beer worlds to be brewing or cider making all year long using frozen juice, but you know, I'm trying to avoid that too, and use fresh juice, so to keep the quality as high as possible. But when you see these real, like, super large cideries that are producing very large quantities, you know, they're buying a lot of frozen juice coming from Hood River, potentially, and Eastern Washington as a base, you know, for their cider, and then adding, you know, something to it that makes it interesting, you know, be it a fruit flavor, hops, or some heirloom fruit or something to bring some interest to that cider. So two very different model there once you start to scale up your cider making.
So tell me about your kind of experience in the Oregon wine industry. What your kind of first impressions of the industry were, and kind of initial experience, and what your impressions are now. What's changed since you've been a part of it?
Well, certainly coming to Oregon as just a wine enthusiast and someone who just enjoyed wines. I guess the thing I've really noticed in the last 25 years is just the really nice blossoming of tasting rooms and hospitality. When we first moved to Oregon, even in 1995, you know, being able to visit wineries was a really big deal for like during the open house weekends of Memorial Day, and then some Labor Day, but certainly Thanksgiving. And we would always put that down on our calendar, and the Oregonian would do a big feature with pullouts, and like, these wineries are only open twice a year. And so that's been, I think that's just been great for the industry to see more wineries willing to invest in on-premise hospitality, and giving out-of-state but also in-state clients more ability to really see that story and connect with the vineyard that might be there. A lot of urban tasting rooms as well, so not necessarily a vineyard experience. But I feel like the quality has done nothing but improve along the way. As people have learned more, and certainly there's been a lot of research in everything from controlling Brett in the winery to better equipment to using just small innovations that occurred along the way, but very significant innovations. Being able to rack or move your wine from a barrel to a tank, not using a pump, which might introduce some oxidation and oxygen, but using a kind of a nitrogen pump, if you will, like just pumping that wine through with nitrogen pressure, so that there's no oxidation that occurs during something that's called racking, or the transfer of wine, from barrel to another barrel, or barrel to a tank, depending on where you are in the process. Just improvements in techniques and equipment, better presses now, and better destemmers that people have. The advent of also much improved filtering technology that something called cross-flow filtration, which doesn't, it's not like a dead end pressure type filtration through media, but it's a much more soft and natural filtration process that's a lot less harsh on the wine, and so can preserve the flavors a lot more, and especially in white wine. Most white wines are sterile filtered so that you don't get malolactic fermentation in your bottle and get fizzy. Sometimes you get a little fizzy white wine and something going on in there, a little bacteria producing bubbles, which can be totally fine and enjoyable. But all of those things have added up to great improvements in maintaining and improving quality in wine. And I think certainly Oregon has, as a wine region, has really stayed as a larger percentage of small wineries compared to other wine regions in the world, maybe, with some notable exceptions, obviously, in Napa and other places. And that, I think, really helps preserve quality as well, for some of the reasons we discussed earlier. So, yeah.
What about as you look ahead? What is Oregon wine industry going to look like in the coming years?
It just seems really bright. One of the reasons I felt really confident in just launching into this industry is the position that Oregon, Willamette Valley in particular, but other Oregon wine viticulture areas are just well received and well known for their quality and their value to quality. It might seem sometimes, we see these like premium pricing above $30, but compared to so many other premium wine areas in California and Europe, still, I think the value is really there for Oregon wines, and Oregon wines continue to outperform in most wine review, third-party review, 90+ scores. There's a higher percentage of the total compared to other wine regions, and so just I think the continued quality is really hopeful for me. I hope that will continue to be the future. It certainly is the trend, what we're known for, and it certainly seems like we're continuing on in that direction. And if you just drive around some of our viticulture areas that are so large, and there's still just tons of room for more vineyards. I really focus on the Yola Amity Hills. I really love that viticulture area where my vineyard sourcing is, and just that elevation and the cool ocean breezes that come through the Van Duzer corridor. But if you look around, you look at the hill, and there's still all these, even Christmas tree farms and orchards, and there's lots of other potential vineyard sites. So I just don't see why that wouldn't just continue, to blossom and grow with, especially as the industry continues to do well. And I feel like we're still kind of in a relatively cool environment compared to some other regions, and with climate change and the warming and shorter vintage times, Oregon is still pretty well positioned for really quality, cool climate grapes. So we're still in a nice sweet spot for the next few decades, hopefully. But hopefully climate change, to me that's a real concern, is climate change and the potential on many things in the world, but including wine quality as well. But certainly fish and wildlife habitat and environmental justice and how climate change affects just those heat islands in the city where a lot of disadvantaged folks don't have the opportunity to have air conditioning or the ability to escape when the heat waves do come, and all the other things that can happen. So it's a big concern. So yeah.
You talked earlier about how you would recommend anyone who was getting into the industry, working in a tasting room, especially for a couple of years, kind of get that aspect of the industry. Tell me what other words of wisdom you'd have for someone who wanted to join Oregon wine industry.
Well, just follow your passion and just get started. You'll find doors that will open for you if you have that in your heart and in your passion. And then, the most difficult thing are the financial resources. I mean, there's just no getting around it. It can be really hard. But start with a barrel or two and find a friend. If you do work at a cellar, you're going to meet winemakers, and they could easily increase their purchase. It might be hard for you to contract directly, but certainly a winemaker friend or a colleague or a boss would be able to increase their order by a fraction and sell you those grapes that you could make at home or even on site. Hopefully that person would be willing to mentor you. And I have some friends, when I think back on my Chemeketa experience, 2 years of studies there, I personally know 5 different classmates, all younger and who didn't have a whole lot of financial resources. They kind of kept their day jobs and got started, and they all started wineries. They started small, and they're doing really well, and some have really taken off. And so it's there if you can pursue it. Maybe keep your desk job, keep your day job for a while. You do have to figure out the financial side of it. But you can get started small and learn as you go, and sell those wines to your, try to make them commercially so you can sell them, as best you can, so you get some feedback too in terms of, it's always easy to get compliments on free wine you're giving people. They're gonna love it, but are they willing to pay $20 for it or whatever? So yeah, just try to take the plunge if you can. Yep. But it can be hard, find the time and find the financial resources. There's no doubt they're going to be difficult. So.
All right, all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover?
Well, 2 things. I mentioned climate change, so something that's very important to me was to set the company up as we are a 1% for the Planet member winery. similar to several others in the valley, and I hope that's something that will continue to grow. So 1% of all of our sales for cider and wine are donated to environmental causes. And one of the things that I really strongly support is we buy carbon offsets. Very easy to do. There's a super local offset company in the Northwest called the Bonneville Environmental Fund. Super easy as an individual or as a business. Even if you don't know exactly what your climate footprint is, don't let that stop you. You know, you can go out and buy 10 tons, or we buy 22 tons a year for the business. And on the home side, we have solar panels and are pretty well set on electricity use. So we just have the car and air travel to worry about. And then on the business side, yeah, I haven't figured out my whole carbon footprint, but we buy 22 tons and we'll try to increase that every year. So it's certainly, you know, an effort, you know, to get to that net zero. And the other thing is, you know, just social justice and diversity in the wine world is certainly lacking still. And so whatever we can all do as owners and winemakers and colleagues to invite and help our black and brown colleagues, and I try to do that as much as I can, and I try to offer free mentorship, as well as for gender, more gender equality and gender non-conforming, all of that. So it would be great to see more diversity, you know, both on the making and ownership side and also on the client side, and have more, you know, be more open to more audiences, and I think that's really important to the winemaking. So it's great to see more attention to that in the past few months, as the nation has turned our attention to that as a larger issue. It seems like it has come up in the wine world as well, which is really nice to see. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, obviously.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for that and for everything, for your interview today, for joining us.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah.
Go ahead and let you off the hook.
All right.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.